All right, got my ukulele. Sing along with me. There were 12 disciples Jesus called to help him. Simon, Peter, Andrew, James and his brother John. Philip, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, Judas, and Bartholomew. He has called us to, he has called us to. We are his disciples, I am one and you. He has called us to, he has called us to. We are his disciples, I am one and you. That's a little rough. Okay, we'll work on that. I hope singing that song through has been a helpful thing for you to learn the names of the disciples. I hope that's going. That's something you can practice between the weeks of our study, and it'll stay with you if you'll do that. Because again, for well more than 50 years, that's how I've remembered the 12 disciples. Hope you have your book, your notebook out there with the listening guides that are with them as we pick up on our study of the disciples. I will try very diligently to fill in all the blanks for you and not skip anything. I often say the most common question I get after I speak is, what was in that blank? Sometimes it's because I missed something. That's usually the case. Sometimes it's because somebody just wasn't listening at the moment. So we'll do that, and we're going to pick up now with the disciple of Simon Peter. We saw last week, we saw Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, and now we see him. And we usually think of them in the listing of the disciples as Peter and Andrew, but we've taken them a bit in reverse order. And of course, there's a lot in the New Testament about Simon Peter. And so we'll take a lot of time on him, and then we'll spend some of our closing moments on Bartholomew, who we know less about, and we can utilize the time well to have one we know a lot about and one that we have to just share a little bit of information about. And so as I did with Andrew and talk about the meaning of name, we actually have names in case of this character. We go as Simon, and we have Peter, and then we have occasionally in the Gospels the name Cephas that is there. So let's go through this, okay? First, the word Simon, and your blank there, it means hearing. Somebody who's a good listener of hearing. And it was a very common name. Maybe more than any other name in the New Testament, we find different people who have the name Simon. I'll walk through them quick. They're on your outline there, and so we identify a few of them. There was a man named Simon who is the father of Judas Iscariot. Just mentioned that there in a couple of passages in John. Simon, the brother of Jesus, or the half-brother, if you would, of Jesus, is the name that is listed. There's a Simon the Zealot that we will have in our study, one of the other disciples, named and known as Simon the Zealot. There's Simon the Pharisee, which is a part of a story where a woman comes and she anoints Jesus' feet, and she was a person of a rough reputation, and Simon the Pharisee said, Jesus wouldn't be allowing that if he knew what kind of a person he was. He can't be a prophet, or he wouldn't be allowing that. And the conversation goes on to tell a parable about forgiveness of two debts, a small debt and a great debt. There is Simon of Cyrene, who we visit during Holy Week as the one who was recruited to help Jesus carry his cross. There is Simon the sorcerer, who became a Christian through the ministry of Philip there in Acts chapter 8. He made the mistake of thinking you could buy the Holy Spirit with money, so he got straightened out. And then Simon the tanner, who is shows hospitality to Simon Peter. We'll get to that part of the story a little later, but he was a guest in the home, Peter was, of Simon the tanner. So we have that name, and then we tend to use the name Peter, which Jesus gives him that name in a couple of places in the gospel, which means a rock, Petros, a rock in Greek. And just to cover bases, Cephas, also occasionally in the gospels referring to Peter, is the Aramaic word for rock. The Aramaic was the spoken language. Greek, Peter, is the Petros is the Greek language, and on a rare occasion, The Gospels, though they are written in Greek, will throw in some Aramaic words. And so perhaps this is just a part of that, but the meaning of the word is the same. Let's talk about family, where we can know some things about people's family. As we shared last week, he does have a brother, and that is Andrew, fishing partner. Perhaps they were in a larger partnership with James and John, as there is the story of Jesus calling them one right after the other, these two pairs of brothers. And so they were certainly in the same business, and perhaps they were business partners that shared in there. We shared last week about Andrew, about the father's name, Jonas or Jonah. And we said this very passage because Jesus identifies Simon as Simon, son of Jonah. There, Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." And so Andrew is a brother, so Jonah is his father, and he is mentioned there. Not much else about him, but it is mentioned. One of the unique things about Simon Peter is he has a mother-in-law that is mentioned in there. Shortly after his calling there, in the early verses of Mark's gospel, it says, as soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. You can underline the word immediately. I said that last time. Mark loves the word immediately. Everything's urgent. So he went to her, took her by the hand, helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. And we don't know otherwise. Perhaps Simon Peter was the only disciple who was married. I don't know that for sure, but perhaps that is the case. But he had a mother-in-law, so he had to have a wife. And we have to salute her. It was going to be certainly challenging, wouldn't it, for your husband to come home from an established business that apparently he was good at, he made a living at it, and say, I'm going to give up all that and go follow this teacher. Certainly there was a lot of insecurities there and a loss of some stability in life and in their way. During some of these times, a couple of months ago actually, Michelle and I began to watch some season 1 of what is called The Chosen, the story of the life of Jesus. I recommend it to you. You can download the app. You can watch it on your phone or your device. You can put it on your television set, casting it, or using a dongle or something. But it's a very interesting telling of the story of Jesus, and it's true to the Gospels pretty much. But the interesting thing is the backstories. It creates a backstory as the story goes along. And one of the interesting backstories is the relationship between Simon and his wife. And the relationship, and at the beginning, she's much more spiritual than he is. But meeting Jesus changes his heart. And so I'll just leave it at that. If you get an opportunity, I'll bring it up a couple of times, I suspect, in this study, because it's worth watching. And season 1 is available for free. And I would encourage you to do that. And let me know what you think. That would be great. So we do have these family relationships that we have. Now, I'm going to focus for a while here on major characteristic that we find in this man. And the word that describes it the best, summarizes it the best, is the word impulsive. He is impulsive. He is ready to jump right in, and like impulsiveness can be, sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not such a good thing. It's featured in a lot of texts, so we'll just have to be a little selective about where we find these things. One of the first good impulsive things we find about Simon is in his calling there. We have really 2 stories of this initial start of his ministry with Jesus. We have the story from John's Gospel we looked at last week when Andrew is a follower of John the Baptist and he decides to follow Jesus after he meets him, and he goes and finds his brother Simon. The first thing he did was find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is the Christ, and he brought him to Jesus. And so he has that initial start where he meets Jesus. Now, again, as I said before, I think they go back to Galilee and they resume their fishing business, and this more formal calling takes place as Jesus approaches them on the Sea of Galilee. I give you the verses there from Mark chapter 1, and it's told in Mark, Luke, and Matthew, all 3 of first 3 Gospels. As Jesus walked back to the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for men." And at once, and frankly, that's the same word, immediately, that Mark uses so often. Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. That's pretty impulsive. You're in the middle of your workday, and you say, "No, I'm going to follow Jesus." And so that's a good impulse. That's a good following, going with your heart, that urgency that we sense in there. Another favorable time of the impulsiveness of Simon is we find in his confession. Jesus had ministered to the disciples for a long time, and yet he had not come right out and said, "I'm the Messiah, I'm the promised one, I'm the one sent from God," hoping that people could recognize him himself. And so he retreats with his disciples to a place called Caesarea Philippi. I like going to Caesarea Philippi in my travels to the Holy Land. It's a bit of a drive, 45 minutes or so, north of the Sea of Galilee, but it's a very beautiful spot. It's an interesting place historically. There is a myth that the god Pan came from there. Sometimes it's called Panias. In Jesus' day, the ruler was named Philip, and so he renamed that location Caesarea Philippi, or Philip's Caesarea. To get good points with the emperor, he named the place Caesarea. There was already another city named Caesarea, so it's called Caesarea Philippi. And so that was a place kind of some political nodding that took place, and you have this mythological background that comes with it. And Jesus chooses this place to ask his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they give him a pretty good response, a good reputation. Some say you are Jeremiah, Isaiah, one of the prophets. Some say John the Baptist. And then he follows up with the more personal question, "Who do you say that I am? What about you?" You see there verse 15 from Matthew's Gospel in chapter 16. "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, and I believe he answered on behalf of the disciples. It wasn't just him, but I believe this was a collective conclusion that they had made. But it's the impulsive one. He's the one that speaks up first anyway. "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah," so there we have his father's name, "for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." What a great passage. You've often heard it quoted, I suspect. I want you to underline a couple of places. I want you to underline where it says the word Peter there. I tell you, you are Peter, and just to fill in the blank down below that, Peter is, say, the Greek word Petros, which means a little rock. A rock you could hold in your hand, maybe even as small as a pebble, but certainly a small rock. And then Jesus says, "But upon this rock," and underline the word rock there, this rock, that's a different Greek word. And it is the word Petra, which means a giant rock, a boulder, or perhaps even a cliff. And I can envision this as he says, you are Peter. You're like one of these little rocks on the ground. But there at Petra, there's this big rocky cliff. He says, "But upon this rock, I will build my church." And I really believe that Jesus is referring to himself there. There's a lot of different interpretations of what Jesus meant when he said, "On this rock, I will build my church." There are those who think that Jesus was designating that Peter was going to be the first pope, and all the history of the church would be built upon him and the successive popes and leaders that would come. There are those who say, no, it's the faith that he showed. Upon this rock, this kind of faith that you've shown in recognizing who I am. But I think Jesus was referring to himself. You are Peter, a little rock, but upon this rock, the Petra, the great rock, I will build my church, that he is the foundation of the church. The church's one foundation is Jesus Christ, her Lord, we sing. And so there's different interpretations of those words, but certainly it's a significant moment there in this impulsiveness of Peter to speak up and give his answer. Now, that the disciples understand who Jesus is and his affirmation of that, then he begins to tell them in the following verses about what the plan is going to be for his life. And so in verse 21, keep reading in your notes. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be crucified and on the third day be raised to life. It was not what their plans were, and frankly, it was not what they wanted to hear. And so notice what it says. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this will never happen to you. I'll see to it. But then notice what Jesus says back. Jesus turned to him and said, get thee behind me, Satan. Circle that word. He just gave him a new name, Peter. You're a rock. And now he's calling him Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You're not something I'm building on. You're a stumbling block. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Yikes. Things go from good to bad so quickly, don't they? It was just this affirmation of flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. To hear now you're listening to Satan. You're standing in the way of God's kingdom and God's plan and what he wants to see take place. So this is one story that we find good impulsiveness and bad impulsiveness both together. We have, could be many examples. I call it of his comment, of his quickness to say something. We just showed one in two ways, good and bad, where he would speak out impulsively about different things, maybe before giving it some of the thorough thought. There's a story in the Gospels. It's called Jesus at the Mount of Transfiguration, where his appearance changes. It becomes white in a white robe and a glow about him, and he is seen with Moses and with Elijah. He's the fulfillment of the law and of the prophets. And so the circle of three, Peter, James, and John are there with him in that. And it says, we'll pick up at verse 32 of Luke 9, Peter and his companions were very sleepy, and when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. And as the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up three shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what he was saying. I've heard it paraphrased this way, and I kind of like it. Peter, not knowing what to say, said. And I've been there, and I bet you have too. I really didn't know what to say, but you said something, and rarely in those occasions do we say the best thing. And Jesus really didn't even acknowledge the comment that Peter had made right there. But it is kind of his nature, just to jump in there and say something. So his comment, we have his confidence. I want to move ahead in the gospel to the night of the Passover meal. Jesus is going to be arrested that night later. He's going to be crucified the next day. And in preparation, he tells his disciples, this very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And Peter replied, this impulsive reply, it's not what he wanted to hear. Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the other disciples said the same. So again, this is where he speaks, but there is this collective unity in there. But it is his words and his confidence. I'm going to stay with you. I will not do what you said I'm going to do. I'm not going to deny you. I'm not going to fall away. I'm not going to dismiss you. I'm not going to leave you. So we find here this boldness, impulsive boldness in Peter, in confidence, in this case, overconfidence. For we know how the story goes of what will take place. Let's go on to another example. I call it he's impulsive in his defense. It's not just words, there's some defense. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is praying. He's praying for strength and for facing the arrest and the crucifixion and the hour that was being upon him. And the temple guards come, led by Judas, who had betrayed him, come to arrest Jesus. And it says, then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear, and the servant's name was Malchus. And there's Simon, doing what he said. I'm going to be at your defense. I'm coming to you. And it's interesting. I'll just put this as a footnote, a side note, that John gives the name of the temple guard who had his ear cut off. His name was Malchus. And why would he put the name there if he didn't expect somehow his readers to recognize who that was? So he says his name. There's lots of unnamed people in the Gospels, but here we have a person by name. Maybe it was because his readers would recognize him. Maybe he became a person of note or notoriety, but I like to think that he became a follower of Jesus. The story goes on that Jesus heals his ear miraculously, and if that had happened to me, that would convince me there was really something holy and special about this man who had healed me. So maybe he went on to be a Christian leader in the early church that we don't know about. But I'll just kind of throw that in there as some possible speculation, but I do like the direction it goes in. The surprise takes place in there when that is a bit what would have been expected to take place. The disciples were going to fight back. I think in some ways Judas was expecting that to happen too and force Jesus into using some of his divine powers to get out of the corner that he was in, about to be arrested. But it says, Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" So Jesus surprisingly here, he's ready to fight, he's ready to defend, and Jesus is going to go peacefully, submissively into the will the Heavenly Father had for him. But the impulsive Simon Peter ready to come to his defense. Again, another place we find impulsiveness in a negative sense is in the three denials, in Jesus' denial. Jesus is arrested. He's taken to the home of the high priest where he is going to stand trial. And Peter has found his way into the outer courtyards. And all of the Gospels tell this story, but I give you the verses from Luke's Gospel. A servant girl saw him seated there by the firelight, and she looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I do not know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also were one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. And about an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly, this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Part of the reason I put the Luke version in there, because he includes that little note that the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter, that they met eyes contact. No wonder he wept bitterly, because it's just in that proximity to see with his eyes, and recognize the fulfillment of what had been said and the disappointment in himself. No wonder that he wept bitterly. Mark's gospel says in his denial that Peter called down curses in that. So intense was he. And he was self-defensive in that. He's worried that whatever fate Jesus was going to face, he was going to face too. But we certainly find an impulsiveness because he did the very thing that he said he wouldn't do. One last illustration of impulsiveness. This comes in the resurrection story. I call it his abruptness. That is his quickness, the impulsiveness in acts as well as words. Mary Magdalene in John's Gospel has a moment with the resurrected Jesus, and she is sent to go tell his disciples. And when she does, both Simon Peter and John run back to the tomb to see for themselves. And we pick up at verse 4 of John 20. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And so he bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. For whatever reason, John hesitates at that point. Now here comes Simon, impulsive Simon. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. Impulsiveness that we see in him, and just an example that abruptness didn't pause to think or hesitate for any reason. It just, again, these are examples of part of the characteristic that we see in Simon Peter. And again, sometimes that is seen in a favorable light, and sometimes it's less than favorable. One of the significant parts about Simon Peter's story is his restoration. He wept bitterly. He knew he had disappointed the Lord. We find in Mark's gospel when the angels say to the women at the tomb, "Go tell his disciples and Peter." He's singled out by name because he knew he was the one who would be the most brokenhearted. He was the one who would be most disappointed. He would be the one who felt like he had lost everything. Go tell his disciples and tell Peter too about what they had seen, and the tomb was empty, and the victory that was coming. So there's one. I give you a little longer story that comes in John's gospel. In John chapter 21, I have a typo down there saying it's John chapter 18. If you'll correct that, these verses are from John chapter 21. Sometimes it's called Breakfast in Galilee, the resurrected Jesus. As we read a moment ago, he said, "I'll meet you in Galilee." And so some of the disciples are in Galilee and they're fishing. They're not having much luck, And Jesus is on the shore and calls to them and creates a situation where they find a great catch, and Peter recognizes Jesus and jumps into the water again. It's an impulsive thing that takes place. And later there's a conversation between Jesus and Simon Peter that is said to be at a place where they have prepared a coal fire of burning coals. And this is just an interesting context that the only other place in the Bible that mentions a fire of burning coals is at the setting of Peter's denial. That there was, just mentions it casually, there was a fire of burning coals. And now here, there's a fire of burning coals. Perhaps a link that is given to us to identify these stories together, the first of several links. So we'll read the conversation that takes place. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Maybe that third time, it says he was hurt because he remembered 3 times that he had denied. And so we find in this little conversation, you can fill in these blanks, 3 denials, 3 questions. Do you love me? 3 answers. Lord, you know that I love you. And 3 commissions. Feed my sheep. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep. And it's a good sermon text to talk to people who feel like they failed the Lord, and maybe they have failed in such a way that they couldn't be useful to him again. They've ruined an opportunity that they had been granted, and just this story of grand restoration. We'll finish up a couple of things about some mentions of Peter in the Gospels. We don't have time to go into these elaborately, but other mentions of Peter in the Gospels, and as noted, not all of them. Matthew's Gospel tells us that he is one who walked out on the water to meet Jesus. That's not shared in Mark or Luke, but Matthew's Gospel particularly says, "Lord, if you will, I'll come out and join you." And impulsive Peter, he does, and it works until his faith gets a little shaky. It was Peter who initiates the question that says, how many times one must forgive? Up to 7 times. And Jesus tells the story, no, 70 times 7. There really should be without limit to our forgiveness. Right after the story of the rich young ruler, who Jesus said, "Sell everything, you'll have treasure in heaven, come follow me." And he doesn't do that. It says that Peter is the one, he is the one who inquired about the reward for those who follow Jesus. "Lord, we've left everything to follow you. We've done what you offered him and he wouldn't do." And so that's, again, a bit of the impulsiveness, maybe also speaking on behalf of all the disciples of what they were all thinking at the time, but he would be the one to say it. Let's look a few things about later parts of the New Testament beyond the Gospels. And so the church era ministry that we find there between the rest of the New Testament, beginning with, in the New Testament, the book of Acts. To a large degree, the book of Acts begins following Peter. Now, it ends following Paul, but the first sections of the book of Acts are following Peter. And when the Holy Spirit falls on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, Peter preaches at that day of Pentecost. And he preaches not the he preaches a sermon about the resurrection and the power of Jesus. It's not about the resurrection, but it's about the resurrection. Anyway, it's just 3,000 people. Thousands of folks come to the Lord on that day because of the power that comes down and allows people to hear in their own language. And Peter is the spokesperson that takes place there. In Acts chapter 10, and I give you some verses here because it's such a significant opening, that Peter opened up to the Gentiles. Remember, all of his life and his upbringing for years, the way to God was through the Hebrew people. If you wanted to be in reconciliation with God, you had to become Hebrew. You had to follow the Jewish faith, and so that was a bit of the thought there. And so we find here that Peter's kind of been brought up in that, and he has to be taught to welcome those who would come into the kingdom of God who didn't have that kind of a background. And so he is, I said a minute ago, there was a person named Simon the Tanner at the beginning, another Simon in the New Testament. And Peter is up on his roof. He's getting some rest. It's in the coastal city of Joppa, so you're getting some nice ocean breeze taking place. About noon the following day, they were on their journey approaching the city, and Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opening and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I've never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times. Hey, you notice this 3-time thing going on with Peter? 3 denials, 3 affirmations in the restoration story, now 3 visions. 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back into heaven. And in the providence and timing of God, at that moment, a Roman centurion named Cornelius, who lived just up the road in Caesarea, asked Peter to come and share with him his understanding of Jesus, share Jesus with him. And Peter goes and he enters into the house of a Gentile, which would be kind of an unusual thing for a good Hebrew person to do. And he says, after he shares the gospel and they respond to it, and the spiritual falling upon them is just like it happened to him in Acts chapter 2. He says, "I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right." That's an eye-opening moment, that the Gentiles can come to the Lord through Jesus just as well as those who were brought through the Hebrew faith and their upbringing. The last mention of Peter in the book of Acts is this point, is Peter was part of the Council of Jerusalem. So the gospel is reaching more Gentiles. The question is, do they have to follow all the dietary laws? Do they have to follow all the sacrificial laws? How do they do that if we really are saved by faith? And so a council takes place of Christian leaders, and they do something that's not too done as much now. It's great statesmanship. They make a little compromise. They work it out, and they understand, we're not going to put the burden on the law. Our people haven't been able to keep it for generations. Why add that to these Gentiles? But they do just kind of request a favor out of respect. Would they not eat meat offered to idols? And would they abstain from sexual immorality? And of course, they said, yes, we'll do that. And so they work out this kind of agreement and middle ground in a sense so they can work together. And just a mention there, again, Peter was a part of that. We move on to beyond the book of Acts. There are 2 letters of Peter toward the end of the New Testament. First Peter tells of our living hope and elaborates about a godly life that differs dramatically from those around us. And so we are the Christ that lives within us is going to affect the way that we live and relate to others. Second Peter affirms that same truth in the face of false teachings, because you don't want to believe everything you hear, and you need to recognize truth from error. Second Peter is addressing that. There is a mention of Peter in Galatians 2, where he and Paul have a disruption because Peter has not shown as much hospitality to the Gentile Christians as really he should have done. And so Paul calls him out on that moment. Again, just kind of as they're working out some things together. The last section there is on church tradition beyond the New Testament era we find. I'll give this summary. After a full life of spreading the beloved gospel, tradition holds that Peter was martyred in Rome about 60 to 69 AD. As the decades pass after the death of Jesus, the Roman Empire becomes increasingly hostile to Christianity and much more persecuting of Christians in that time. Now, there is a well-known tradition that during the persecution of Nero, Peter has the opportunity to escape Rome where he is and to save his life. And as he is walking out the city of Rome, he comes to a place called the Appian Way, at the certain road, a junction, if you would, and he sees Jesus carrying a cross back, going the opposite way of him toward Rome. And there's a little artistic rendering of that on your last page of this section of your notes. And he asks Jesus, "Where are you going?" And Jesus says he's going back to Rome. He's going to be crucified a second time. And that is more than Peter's heart could bear, that Jesus would have to be crucified a second time. So he turns around and goes back, and he is arrested. We said last week that Andrew didn't feel worthy to be crucified on the same kind of cross as Jesus, and so it was an X-shaped cross, the St. Andrew's cross. Peter asked to be crucified upside down. And so as you see in the shield there below, the upside down cross that is there too. And so the upside down cross, a symbol of the disciple Peter. The keys there, remember Jesus said in Peter's confession, a verse we didn't look at, but Jesus says, "I give you the keys to the kingdom." And so a key is symbolized Peter. If you go in cathedrals and churches and such, and you see statues of, wonder who that is. If the statue, it's a biblical looking statue and somebody's carrying a key, it's probably a statue of Peter, because that is the symbol identified with him. I'll close with this little bit of an observation. There is in business world, I was a business major in college, and so a business leader named Lawrence Peter, and he had what he called the Peter Principle. You might have heard of it. Peter Principle says that people are promoted in the ranks of leadership till eventually you get to a place that is beyond your ability to handle, that the responsibility is greater than your capability. And so ultimately you're destined for failure, I guess, because you get beyond your ability to manage. That's the Peter Principle in management. But I like the St. Peter Principle. And it's a bit of the opposite, certainly more optimistic. God continues to elevate us even with our faults. And here came Peter. He's like this diamond in the rough. He's impulsive. He jumps to conclusions. He needs to think things through a little bit. He's not from a well-taught background. And he's this diamond in the rough, but the Lord uses him through his beautiful grace in Jesus Christ to be a testimony of the wisdom of faith in the Lord and through an all-knowing, all-powerful God that we have. And so that's a long time that we've talked here about. In the moments that we have remaining, if you look to the next part of your listening guide, we are going to talk just a little bit about Bartholomew. And Bartholomew is found on all the lists in the Gospels and the New Testament. Remember I said there's a list in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the book of Acts. Bartholomew is found in all of those. And like I said, with names, we like to look at the meaning of the name. Remember that Jesus says to Simon, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. You are the son of Jonah." Bar-Jonah. So the word B-A-R in front of the name means son of. So son of Tomai is Bartholomew. That Tomai is a bit of an abbreviation of Tholomew. Now there is a Tomai that's in the Old Testament. And I'll just give you the place there. Tomai was a king of Geshur, whose daughter Maacah was the wife of David and mother of Absalom. I guess that makes him, does that make him Absalom's grandfather? So it has been concluded that he was the only one of the 12 disciples that came from royal blood. I guess that's a possibility. It could just be that was a popular name. that was taking place. I also wanted to note that it kind of reads like a last name. It was Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah, Jonas. And so to say Bartholomew, son of Tomai, I mean, he had a first name. Said as we were looking at the disciples initially, that there is a Nathaniel in John's gospel that is called one of the disciples. And it is thought that Nathaniel may have been the same character Bartholomew. So maybe it is the way of saying Bartholomew, like a last name, is this disciple's last name. His first name is Nathaniel, so Nathaniel Bartholomew. And we know there are people at times that we get to know better by their first name. They're called by their first name, they're called by their last name, just hey, and use the last name instead of the first name. Maybe that fell into place here in his life. And people called him Bartholomew, but sometimes they called him Nathaniel. So that's a bit of speculation, but it does kind of, in a way, reconcile that we have these names in all the lists, but John's gospel has a different name of a disciple. Let's look at his calling. If indeed Nathaniel is Bartholomew, then I said Andrew meets Jesus as the disciple of John the Baptist and brings his brother Simon to meet Jesus. Then Philip finds Nathanael, it tells us in John chapter 1, or Bartholomew, if that's the case, and told him, "We found the one Moses wrote about in the law, of whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." "Nazareth, can anything good come from there?" Nathanael asked. "Come and see," said Philip. And when he does meet Jesus, Jesus acts as if he already knows who Nathanael is. Jesus saw Nathanael approaching. He said of him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Now, fig trees, just a little note here, was typically a place where rabbis would sit and study and sometimes teach, so maybe isolated or maybe students sitting there by themselves. It was a learning place, and so maybe he had seen him with a scroll or a copy of a portion of the law or a reading taking place, and gave him a good word of praise. Nathanael declares, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." What it seemed took the other disciples a while to figure out. In John's gospel, he's declaring it from the very beginning, isn't he? And I just have to think Jesus had a smile on his face when he says what he says. "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? That's all it took? And you believe this? You will see greater things than that." And he added, "Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven open, the angel of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man," as if to say to Nathanael here, you ain't seen nothing yet. All it took was my understanding that saw you under a tree. You ain't seen nothing but what you're going to see as you follow me. Well, let's look at the gospel ministry there. We don't have too much to go on in the Gospels, but aside from the list of the disciples where Bartholomew is mentioned just as name, Nathanael is mentioned in maybe the same person, probably, is mentioned in John chapter 21 as one of those handful of disciples that after the resurrection went to Galilee, were fishing that night, and Jesus appeared on the shore, and they had a miraculous catch of fish, and Jesus and Simon Peter had that conversation that we talked about where Jesus asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Doesn't say anything about Nathanael that night except that he was in the boat. And so we acknowledge that he is there. And like we saw Andrew last week, when we get into the book of Acts, his name is mentioned. Bartholomew's name is mentioned in chapter 1 of Acts as the list of the disciples, never mentioned again. So the only thing we can go by as far as where his life took him was by some traditions. So let me pass along a few things to you. Tradition indicates he was a great searcher of the scripture and a scholar, is that blank, in the law and the prophets, as well as an adventurous missionary, one who liked to travel and get out there, sometimes in the difficult places to go. It is thought, the tradition says, he was a missionary in Armenia, which would have been east of modern-day Turkey, an area that he would have been in. However, there is also a tradition that he preached in India. So sometimes you have different traditions that have followed these disciples. According to Fox's Book of Martyrs, a very well-known book of Christian history and how followers of Jesus died over the years. It is said he had preached through India. He translated the Gospel of Matthew into a language that they could understand. It is said that he converted the king of Armenia, said part of the tradition was in Armenia, that he converted the king of Armenia to Christianity, and that king's brother was so mad about that he ordered Bartholomew's execution. And reports are, as you can see it noted, reports are he was flayed alive or skinned alive with knives, and that is why the shield there representing Bartholomew has those 3 knives upon it. And oftentimes in statues and in artwork, you will actually see Bartholomew kind of holding his skin because his death was very morbid to be skinned alive. Now I have over in the other corner there a little section of the part of the Final Judgment painting by Michelangelo. You go to the Sistine Chapel, you look first to the ceiling and the wonder and amazement of that, but you also behind the altar there's this big painting of Jesus in his final judgment, and it's very busy and there's a lot of characters in there, and you can look in there and you can find detail. You can find this one character, and I get his drawing there for you, and that's Bartholomew. And I hope you can't hardly see it, but in his right hand he is holding the knife. Remember I said the knives were symbolic of him. In his left hand he's holding his skin, and there is a thought that Bartholomew's painting here, this rendering of Bartholomew, the person painted, looks a little like Michelangelo. And so maybe Michelangelo painting himself into this picture, and the person he chose to paint to represent him was Bartholomew. We don't know. Just in the closing thought there before we finish for today, this is the disciple. He gathered very few lines in the Gospels. We don't know much at all about him, about his background, where he came from, his trade, very little. But nevertheless, in that instant, he became a loyal follower of Jesus. When however that happened, he was chosen and accepted the call to follow him. And even though it took him to his death, and as tradition holds, a very painful, difficult way, we hold him in high esteem as one of those who would be a disciple of the Lord. And it gives me inspiration to say, Lord, help me show courage and be true to you no matter what the circumstances, and may I be a witness of your truth as I go out my day. Let that be a challenge to you to show the love of Jesus in the world around you in the week ahead. And we'll join next week as we continue our study. Have a good week.